How many stages are there in the A320 Preliminary Cockpit Preparation SOP and what are they? Before an A320 even starts taxiing, we follow a very specific cockpit flow. This is not a random button pushing. This is preliminary cockpit preparation and it has 9 main stages. First we set up the aircraft. Then we check the batteries and external power. After that we do the APU fire test and start the APU. Then we set the ADIRS to nav. Next we adjust the cockpit lights. Then we initialize the EFB, ADIRS installed and the FMGS. After that we complete aircraft acceptance. Then we prepare the preliminary performance in FlightSmart and the last stage is before walkaround. So the answer is 9 main stages, from aircraft setup all the way to before walkaround. That is the difference between just turning on the A320 and preparing it like a real Airbus crew. What items are checked during the aircraft setup stage of the A320 preliminary cockpit preparation? Before we power up the A320, the first cockpit stage is aircraft setup. This is where we make sure the basics are safe. Engine 1 and engine 2 master levers are off, the engine mode selector is in norm position. The weather radar and predictive wind shear are off, the landing gear lever is down and both wipers selectors are off. It sounds simple, but this prevents accidental system operation before the aircraft is ready. That is the first step of real A320 preliminary cockpit preparation. How many battery check options are there during A320 preliminary cockpit preparation and what determines which one we use? 2, and the choice depends on one simple question. Was the aircraft electrically supplied during the last 6 hours? If not, we first check that both batteries are off, then we check battery voltage above 25.5 volts. If the voltage is too low, the batteries need a charging cycle before we continue. But if the aircraft was electrically supplied during the last 6 hours, the check is simpler. We set battery 1 and battery 2 to auto. So the key is not a habit, the key is the electrical supply history of the aircraft. How do we charge the A320 batteries if battery voltage is at or below 25.5 during preliminary cockpit preparation? We do not just continue, the batteries need a charging cycle. We set battery 1 and battery 2 to auto, then we connect external power. On the electrical page we check that the battery contactors are closed and the batteries are charging. After about 20 minutes, we switch the batteries off again and recheck the voltage. Only when both batteries are above 25.5 volts do we set them back to auto. That is how we make sure the batteries have enough charge before the flight. How do we perform the APU fire test and APU start during A320 preliminary cockpit preparation? First, we set the radios. The RMP must be on and set. The green nav light must be off, the cell light must be off, and we tune the communication frequencies. Then we check the APU fire system. The APU fire push button must be in and guarded. The APU agent light must be off. Then we press and hold the APU fire test push button. We should see the APU fire warning, hear the continuous repetitive chime, see the master warning flash and see the APU fire push button turn red. The squeak and discharge lights must also come on. But we do not hold the test push button more than 3 seconds. After the test, we start the APU. APU master switch on, APU start on. When APU available appears, we set the air conditioning panel and use external power as required. That is the APU fire test and start logic before the cockpit preparation continues. How do we use the 3 VHF radios in the A320? It's not random. VHF 1 is normally used for ATC. That is important because in emergency electrical configuration only VHF 1 remains available. VHF 2 is normally used for ATIS and company frequencies. And VHF 3 is normally dedicated to ADIRS and data link. So the simple rule is this. VHF 1 talks to ATC, VHF 2 supports ATIS and company, VHF-3 usually works in the background for cars. That is how the A320 keeps communication organized before the flight even begins. When should the flight crew select all IR mode selectors to nav during preliminary cockpit preparation, and why? Not immediately in every case. During the preliminary cockpit preparation, we do it in the ADIRS stage. For this SOP node, we wait at least 12 minutes after aircraft power up. Then we select all IR mode selectors to nav. Why? To prevent erroneous data initialization. The IRS alignment must be done with the aircraft stopped on the ground, not during engine start, not while the engines are running, because if the aircraft moves during alignment, the crew must perform a new full alignment. That is why ADIRS setup is not just switching 3 knobs. When should a complete IRS alignment be performed? Not every turnaround needs one, but in some cases it is required. We perform a complete IRS alignment before the first flight of the day. We also do it when there is a crew change. Another case is when the departure airport is close to the equator, between 2 degrees north and 2 degrees south. We also need it when GPS is not available and the expected route has poor navigate coverage. And finally, when GPS is not available and the expected flight time is more than 3 hours. Why does this matter? Because during a complete alignment, the IRS uses gravity and Earth rotation to build a reliable navigation reference. So this is not just waiting for 3 lights to go out. Before we go flying, the aircraft learns its location. When do we perform a fast IRS alignment in the A320? Not when a complete alignment is required. Fast alignment is used when a complete IRS alignment is not necessary. But there is one important condition. If the difference between the IRS position and the FMGC position is 5 nautical miles or more, we perform a fast IRS alignment. We check the difference on the MCDU position monitor page. During a fast alignment, the IRS resets the ground speed and some internal filters to 0. But it does not calculate a new aircraft position like a complete alignment. So the rule is simple. Complete alignment when required. Fast alignment when complete alignment is not required. But the IRS and FMGS positions differ by 5 nautical miles or more. That is how we clean up the navigation reference before the flight begins. How do we set the cockpit lights during A320 preliminary cockpit preparation? Not all cockpit lighting is just for comfort. It is part of building a readable flight deck. During this stage, we set the cockpit lights as required. That includes the internal lights, the floodlights, and the integral lights. We also make sure the glare shield and FCU lighting are properly set. Why does this matter? Because before we work with the EFB, ADIRS and FMGS, both pilots must clearly see the panels, displays and controls. So cockpit lighting is not a decoration. It is part of preparing the A320 like a real crew. How do we check the EFB and eQRH version during A320 preliminary cockpit preparation? We do not just open the tablet and assume it is correct. During the EFB and ADIRS initialization stage, we start all EFBs. Then, if required by company policy or regulation, we check the EFB and eQRH version. On the EFB status page, we check the EFB version number. On the eQRH My Aircraft page, we check the eQRH aircraft version. Then we compare it with the valid version given by the operator. That reference may be on the company flight plan. Why does this matter? Because the EFB and eQRH must match the aircraft and the current valid documentation. In the cockpit, the wrong version can lead the crew to the wrong procedure. What do we do during FMGS pre-initialization in the A320? We do not start pressing MCDU keys immediately after electrical power-up. First, the FMGS and the FCU run their internal tests. We give them enough time to finish, about 3 minutes. And if the MCDU shows "please wait," we do not press any MCDU key until that message disappears. Then we begin the FMGS pre-initialization. We check the engine and aircraft type. We check the FM database validity. Then we insert or check the flight number. And we insert or check the from to airports. Why does this matter? Because the FMGS is the brain of the flight plan. Before we build the route, performance and predictions, we need to make sure the system is awake, correct and ready. What do we check during aircraft acceptance in the A320? This is where we decide if the aeroplane is technically acceptable for the flight. First, we press and hold the recall push button for 3 seconds. This recalls warnings or cautions that may have been cleared or cancelled during the previous flight. Then we check the logbook and mail or SDL items. We look at the deferred defects. We cross-check them with ECAM recall. And we discuss how they affect the flight, the procedures and the performance. Next, we check the aircraft configuration summary. This tells us which optional systems or functions are installed on this aircraft, and we discuss how they may affect today's operation. Then we review the OEBs. These are operational bulletins that may require special crew awareness or procedures. Why does this matter? Because before we prepare performance or brief the departure, both pilots must share the same technical picture of the aircraft. Aircraft acceptance is not just a paperwork, it is the crew confirming what kind of airplane they are really taking into the sky. What do we do during preliminary performance in the A320? This is where both pilots start building the takeoff plan, but they do not just copy one number from one screen. Each flight crew member independently computes the preliminary takeoff performance. We take into account the technical condition of the aircraft. We also check anything that can affect performance. No terms, runway condition, aircraft configuration. Then both pilots discuss the key takeoff choices. Which runway intersection, which flap setting, anti-ice on or off, PEX on or off, and the takeoff thrust option, flex, toggle or derate when applicable. After that, the pilot flying and pilot monitoring compare their calculations, and the numbers must match. Then both pilots review the contingency plan, for example the engine out SID. Why does this matter? Because takeoff performance is not one pilot trusting one result. It is two pilots building the same takeoff picture before the aircraft ever moves. What do we check before the walkaround in the A320? This is the last cockpit safety scan before one pilot goes outside. First we check the ECAM pages. We confirm oxygen pressure, hydraulic quantity and the engine oil quantity. Then we check the flight control configuration, flap position, speed brake lever at retracted and disarmed. Next, we check accumulator and brake pressure. Then we confirm the parking brake is on. After that, we check the alternate braking system. We also check the emergency equipment. Then we check the rain repellent pressure and quantity, if installed. Next, we check the rear and overhead circuit breaker panels. And finally, we confirm the landing gear pins and covers are on board and stowed. And why does this matter? Because before the outside inspection starts, the cockpit must already tell us that the aircraft is safe to inspect. The walkaround begins outside, but the safety picture starts inside the flight deck.